Welcome to sqadia.com, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Muhammad Osama, and today we are talking about interpretation of diagnostic tests and laboratory statistics. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the topic prevalence and incidence, in which we are going to talk about what is prevalence and what is incidence and how can we calculate them, and also the difference between the prevalence and incidence. Prevalence is a very commonly term which is used in epidemiology and in also medical sciences. We get to hear about it a lot. So, what is prevalence? So, if we talk about epidemiology, so prevalence in epidemiology is the proportion of a particular part or segment of population found to be affected by a medical condition. So, for example, if there is a population or a sample and there are a lot of people who have hepatitis C, for example, so we can say that this population has a high prevalence for hepatitis C. So, prevalence is typically regarding a disease or a risk factor such as smoking. So, it is not obvious that it would always be regarding a disease. For example, prevalence of diabetes in a specific community. But it can also be regarding a risk factor. For example, obesity is a risk factor for different conditions. Like smoking is a risk factor for example, different type of pulmonary conditions. So, it can also be the prevalence of different type of risk factors, such as prevalence of obesity, prevalence of smoking, and prevalence of any other risk factor. It is also arrived at by comparing the number of people found to have the condition divided by the total number of people studied. So, in that context, for example, if we look at this example here, we can see that the total population is 225, and there are a number of individuals or a number of cases that have that specific kind of condition or disease. So, they are, for example, 75. So, in order to calculate the percentage prevalence for that, we can divide 75 by 225, which is the total number of cases divided by the total number of individuals in that sample population. And by dividing 75 by 225, we get 0.33. In order to convert into percentage, we multiply it by 100 and we get the percentage. For example, here we get the 33%. So, for example, if we were calculating the prevalence of, let's say, diabetes, so we can say that the prevalence of diabetes in this sample population was 33%. But sometimes the prevalence can also be expressed as a fraction or as a number of cases per 10,000 or 100,000 people. So we can say that there were, let's say, 60 out of 10,000 people had this disease. So it is not necessary or obvious that it should be expressed in percentage. It can be expressed in fraction, percentage, or number of cases per 10,000 or 100,000 people. This is specifically done for those kind of conditions or diseases which are not so common. Now let's talk about the different types of prevalence. So we have the point prevalence, the period prevalence, and the lifetime prevalence. So, point prevalence is the proportion of a population that has the condition at a specific point in time. For example, if we go to the population and we are trying to look out how much individuals have that specific kind of disease at that specific time at which we visited that population, so that would be point prevalence. Peer prevalence is the proportion of a population that has the condition at some time during a given time period. For example, a 12-month prevalence. So a peer prevalence can be 1 week prevalence, 6-month prevalence, 12-month prevalence, or any of that sort, depending on the type of study or analysis that we are wishing to conduct. And it includes people who already have the condition at the start of the study period, as well as those who acquire it during that period. So, for example, we go to a population at a specific point in time and we went there and we asked or we looked at how many individuals had that specific kind of disease. So, it would not only incorporate those people who had that specific disease at the time of the study, but also those people who may not have the disease at that time, but they may have had that disease, or they may have that disorder in the previous 12 months per se. So that would be an example of period prevalence. Now, lifetime prevalence is the proportion of a population that at some point in their life have experienced the condition. So it is for those type of assessments or analysis in which a person had a disease at any time in his life would be counted as as an individual or as a case for calculating that prevalence. So calculating the prevalence, or prevalence is interpreting the value of the prevalence, is different in different cases. So we say that there's 33% prevalence. So that is not enough. We need to know that what type of prevalence was that. Was it a point prevalence? Was it a period prevalence? Or was it a lifetime prevalence? So that is very important to understand. So let's take an example which can actually explain us on the basis of what would be the difference between the point prevalence, the period prevalence, and the lifetime prevalence. So I go to a specific segment of population and I want to see that how many individuals have neck pain. So I ask the individuals from that population and I come to know that 10% of the individuals have neck pain. So that would be point prevalence. Now I modify the question and I ask the individuals that, did you have neck pain in the last 12 months? So I'm calculating, or I'm trying to find out the period prevalence for the last 12 months. Now, once again, in order to calculate the prevalence, I can also calculate the lifetime prevalence. For that, I would be asking, did you have neck pain for any time, or did you have neck pain at any time in your life? Then that would be calculating lifetime prevalence. And as obvious, the lifetime prevalence would be higher as compared to period prevalence, which would be higher as compared to point prevalence. Now, what is incidence? Incidence may sound like that it is the same thing as the prevalence, or some people may perceive it so as well, but it is different from that. So, incidence in epidemiology is a measure of the probability of occurrence of a given medical condition in a population with a specific period of time. So, it is also loosely expressed for easy understanding as the number of new cases during some time period. So it is better expressed as a proportion or rate with the denominator, and it has a very important role of time. So it is still different from the, as you can see, period prevalence, because in period prevalence we can see that anyone who had neck pain in the 12 months was taken as a case. But when we are talking about incidence, or for example, if you're talking about 12-month incidence instead of 12-month prevalence, so we will only count the cases who develop neck pain, for example, in the last 12 months, but not those individuals who have neck pain in this duration, but they developed it before the 12 months period of time. So that would be not included. So that is the difference between incidence and prevalence. So incidence proportion, also known as cumulative index, is the number of new cases within a specified time period divided by the size of the population initially at risk. So in order to understand that, let's take an example on how can we calculate the incidence. So if a population initially contains 1,000 non-diseased person and the people had no disease, for example, none of them had neck pain, but in that time period when we were conducting the study, let's say for the last 2 years, so in those 2 years, out of those 1,000 people, 28 people developed neck pain. So what we do is we would actually divide 28 by 1,000 and then we would multiply it with 100, and that would give us the incidence per 2 years, or for the last 2 years, and that is, for example, 2.8 years per 2 years. So that is incidence. So it is actually focusing on the new cases, newly diagnosed cases. Now, how is prevalence different from incidence? So, prevalence is contrasted to incidence in a way that it is a measure of new cases arising in a population over a given period. So, incidence is a measure of new cases arising in a population over a given period, whereas prevalence also includes the individuals who had the condition well before that time of assessment. The difference between prevalence and incidence can be summarized by a few questions. For example, if we wish to ask the prevalence, the question would be how many people have this disease right now? It can include both the new cases and the old cases. On the other hand, how many people have had this disease during this time period can also be a question to find out the prevalence. But on the other hand, if we talk about the incidence, so the more appropriate question would be how many people per year newly acquire this disease? And it can also be how many people per month or how many people per 2 years. It can change, it is subjective to change. But the question would be how many people newly acquire this disease? That is the thing to be focused on. So, in this part of the lecture, we talked about prevalence, incidence, and the difference between the two. I hope you learned something new out of it and stay tuned to sqadia.com for more lectures like this. Thank you very much for watching sqadia.com.